I am Dr. Geeta Puttaraju, working at the Institute of Public Enterprise Management. This module is on improving performance of public enterprises, a global perspective. While introducing the topic of performance contracting, the global experiences, there is one very important thing that we all need to know, that performance contracting in public enterprises are broadly divided into two categories. First is the French type of performance contracts and the other signaling system, the French system and the signaling system. The French contracts were more subjective in nature, and the signaling system, which was followed by Pakistan, South Korea, etc., they were a combination of both quantitative and qualitative aspects of performance management in public enterprises. So broadly, and performance contracting was categorized into French type of contracts as well as signaling system. In the era of privatization, global concern has been how the public enterprises, which are also called the state-owned enterprises globally, how they function. This is a matter of prime concern for the policymakers because the state-owned enterprises control the natural resources in the economy. This is particularly true for the less developed countries where the use of natural resources optimally for everybody's good is very important and for the growth of economy. Another aspect is that public enterprises, which are also called state-owned enterprises globally, have spread over various sectors of the economy. The growth of public enterprises in these countries is a direct measure of the success or failure of the government. There is a general belief that public enterprises have failed to deliver or have not performed to their core. There have been alternative mechanisms that have been adopted by different countries. The developed countries have introduced certain very interesting methods which have been adopted by the less developed countries. For instance, Africa, Asia and other countries have adopted systems of performance contracting, looking at the systems of France, UK, Canada, etc. So performance contracting is a system that was adopted by many countries to bring back public enterprises on the path of performance. As we all know, public enterprises have conflicting objectives. They have been constituted, especially in India, post-independence, with a double objective. Firstly, they were expected to fulfill the social objective of the country, wherein public enterprises had to be engines for filling the gap of regional disparity, and also they were meant to be vehicles for equal distribution of wealth across the nation. On the other side, the objective of public enterprises was also a commercial objective. They were meant to do business on lines of the private enterprise and also produce goods on the lines of a manufacturing or a service providing company. So with these conflicting objectives, the public enterprises were working on government laid foundations while they were supposed to perform on a commercial basis. At the same time, unlike the counterparts in the private sector, being public, they had to serve the public interest. However, private enterprise may be, it cannot escape its obligation towards the broader public good. Secondly, the government as an overall supervisor controls the public enterprises through a number of regulatory measures. In the module on accountability of public enterprises, we have already seen how public enterprises are controlled through various mechanisms, including the Parliament, the administrative ministries, the Department of Public Enterprises, the Vigilance, the Comptroller and Auditor General, and many other similar bodies. This is a specific disadvantage, especially in the developing economies. But if the government remains indifferent in these aspects, the public enterprises labor under severe structural handicaps, which endanger not only their performance but also the economy as a whole. This is a greater risk. because the public enterprises are required to occupy the commanding heights. Now let us look at what is performance contracting. Let us conceptualize performance contracting. With the beginning of reforms in public sector, performance contracting system was introduced as a mechanism for enhancing efficiency and effectiveness of public enterprises. It is a management tool. Performance contracting is nothing but a management tool for ensuring accountability, for enhancing efficiency and delivery of public enterprises, because it helps in measuring the extent to which the public enterprises have achieved their results. Let us look at some of the conceptual theories that have been formulated around the concept of performance contracting. Domberger in 1998 says that performance contracting is a branch of management science referred to as management control systems. It is a contractual arrangement to execute a service according to agreed upon terms within an estimated time period and with a stipulated use of resources and performance standards. Greer in 1999 says that performance contract as a useful tool for articulating clearer definitions of objectives and supporting innovative management, monitoring and control methods, and at the same time imparting managerial and operational autonomy to public service managers. OECD has given a definition for performance contracting. It has defined the performance contracting in 1999. According to OECD, performance contracts are a range of management instruments used to define responsibility and expectation between parties to achieve mutually agreed results. Hunter and Gates in 1998 view performance contract especially as an agreement between a government and a public agency which establishes general goals for the agency, sets targets for measuring performance, and provides incentives for achieving these targets. They include a variety of incentive-based mechanisms for controlling the public agencies, controlling rather the outcome rather than the processes. Wheeler in 2001 says that the success of performance contracts in diverse countries as France, Pakistan, South Korea, Malaysia, India, and Kenya has sparked a great deal of interest in this policy around the world. Now let us look at the concept of performance evaluation in public enterprises. The year 1967 marks a watershed in the annals of French public enterprises. France was the first country that introduced the concept of performance contracting in public enterprises. This is the year in which the NORA committee, which was appointed by the French government to inquire into the functioning of public enterprises and suggest measures for their improvement. The committee submitted its report to the government. The report brought out to light the confusion arising out of excessive control of government to the public enterprises, and it brought forth the sense of need for more autonomy, functional autonomy, and accountability of public enterprises. The report also called for a classification of the government-public enterprise relationship, because public enterprises, being agents of government, need to clearly define their relationship in order to avoid this kind of a confusion. This report envisaged essentially two program measures. First one, increased autonomy to management of the public enterprises, and second, a realistic pricing policy in order that the units do not have to depend on the government for balancing their accounts. So mainly the NORA committee, which was appointed by the French government, was the first committee to have spelled out in clear terms the need for creating a system of autonomy for public enterprises, and also some kind of establishing a realistic pricing policy for the public enterprises to function effectively. The program contract gave a new orientation of relationship of the public enterprise with the government. It called for a multi-annual programming of the manpower and resources available to the enterprise, following posterior control over a priori control. This new orientation brought the public enterprise closer to the management pattern followed in the private firms. Thus, the program contract came out as an instrument for rationalizing the management of public enterprises. So when we look back at the history of performance contracting globally, it is France which started the system of program contract, which was also called performance contracting system, in which they defined a clear relationship between the public enterprises and the government and gave more autonomy and a more organized way of planning the performance of public enterprises in order to give them more space to perform effectively. The program contract had a number of advantages. The program contract removes the public enterprises from the enclave and returns them to the market economy because they start functioning like on the lines of the private firms. It ensures that the management of public enterprises would be similar to that of private firms with the aim of rationality and efficiency. This would mean that the enterprise would know their objectives for the next how many years, like 5 to 7 years, whatever the government decides, the annual planning methods, and set the financial targets which it has to reach. This makes long-term, medium-term and short-term programming very easy. Moreover, the enterprises are also not burdened by excessive supervision because the targets are set and the financial goals are already earmarked. That makes it easier for the enterprise to perform and reach those set targets. The program contract serves as a planning at two levels. At macro level, it helps in the national planning process. Second, at the micro level, as it helps the enterprise to develop a realistic business plan. According to the NORA report, its purpose, that is, the program contract was initiated with the purpose to improve efficiency in the management of public enterprises by seeking maximum consistency among the plans of individual enterprises. Let us look at how these program contracts in France actually functioned. As we have earlier mentioned, France was the first country to have initiated program contracts in order to improve the efficiency of public enterprises. But the program contracts had certain issues. They had no standard format for the program contracts across the board. A few of the program contracts that were executed had 4 essential elements. This gave rise to a high degree of subjectivity rather than making the system more objective. The strategy of the public enterprises was set for a medium term, 3 to 5 years. Enterprises were allowed to plan their performance for 3 to 5 years based on the government's macro policy for development. Second one, propositions formulated by the enterprises for adopting this strategy to the fundamental goals of the French government's economic policy. They had to align their annual planning to the fundamental goals of their government policy. The third was areas of financial relations with government, especially the financial targets of the enterprise had to be matched. The government's obligation to cover the additional costs of non-commercial objectives and relevant procedures for achieving this reciprocal commitment. The NORA committee envisaged these measures in the framework of well-defined contract, which would list out objectives expected to be fulfilled by public enterprises as well as the financial assistance to be given by the government. The contract would also quantify the constraints to the enterprises arising out of its obligation to the public interest and compensate the public enterprise fully to this count. That means their social objective, they had a social objective which they had to fulfill, and that had come out very clearly in the program contract. For the enterprise in the competitive sector, the report envisaged primarily the establishment of sound management principles in line with their counterparts in the private sector. Thus were born the first generation of contracts. Now let us look at the performance contracting. South Korea. South Korea is also a country which has gone much ahead with performance contracting of the state-owned enterprises, and this program contracting system has helped them to achieve good results. South Korea has a history of embracing capital market forces as industrious labor force and dynamic private entrepreneurs. These are complemented with a government which encourages economic growth through progressive economic policy. And yet, surprisingly, the public sector played an important role in the development of robust Korean industry. The role played by public sector in Korean economic development was in line with the Korean government's commitment to various economic goals such as export promotion, accelerated development of heavy industry, and effective distribution of public utilities. In Korea, the public enterprises are called the Government Invested Enterprises, GIEA. However, the GIEs were not successful in achieving the levels of performance that was expected by them. By the late 1970s, the disappointing financial performance of GIEs and their burden on public resources dented the reputation of public sector and became a concern for the Korean public management. Prior to introduction of Government Invested Enterprise Management Act in 1984, several factors contributed to the inefficient performance of GIEs in Korea, such as low rate of return on capital, increasing number of deficit enterprises, excessive government interference in operations of GIEs, extensive government control on enterprise was facilitated through various laws and regulations such as Government Invested Enterprise Budget Accounts Act, Government Invested Enterprise Administration Act. So just like India, even South Korea suffered the excessive control through various government agencies on the public enterprises. The above mentioned laws were supplemented by special laws such as Government Invested Establishment Act. Government control was leading to inefficiency in the Korean public enterprises. While the importance of government control in the early phases of enterprises is accepted, such government control in the operation of well-established enterprises usually leads to poor performance of enterprises. Autonomy is critical in public sector enterprises because the management must have the confidence to take decisions without fear of intervention by government officials, which was absent in the Korean public sector enterprise scenario prior to 1983. Performance of enterprise was also affected by appointments being made on political considerations instead of managerial professionalism. Multiple principles such as Line Ministry, Ministry of Finance, Economic Planning Board and Board of Audit all exercised their control in terms of appointments, financial management, etc. Korean enterprises hence had to deal with multiple principles and multiple objectives, hindering the decision making of managers who were unsure as to what the enterprises was expected to do. The public enterprises in Korea are divided into four categories: government enterprises, government invested enterprises, subsidiary companies of GIEs, and other government-backed enterprises. Korea's significant step for improving performance of public sector enterprises came in 1984 with the establishment of the Government Invested Enterprise Management Act, which was passed on 16th December. This legislation had two primary objectives. The first was to enhance managerial autonomy and improve accountability and get rid of excessive management control. Through this act, the Korean government introduced a system of management by objectives (MBO). It also introduced a system of preparation of budgets. For example, the enterprises were expected to prepare budgets in policies such as increasing the autonomy of managers over a range of enterprise operations like procurements, budgeting, and personnel policy. A two-tiered management organization was introduced with the board of directors as a decision-making body and enterprise president as a chief executive in charge of implementation. Audits of enterprises from outside were also simplified, and business supervision by technical ministries was practically removed. And importantly, an ex-post evaluation system with a linked performance incentive system was also introduced. In order to make this evaluation system work and function effectively, several key institutions in the Korean government and in the GIEs had to be fine-tuned. There was a lot of process re-engineering that was done in South Korea to ensure that this system worked efficiently. The Korean government machinery was put in place to evaluate enterprise performance as follows. There was a GIE Management Evaluation Council established. It is the highest council concerned with the overall management of GIEs. This council formulates general guidelines for preparing the management objectives and budgets of GIEs and evaluates managerial performance. The chairperson is the Minister of Economic Planning. The other members are Minister of relevant technical ministries and 3 temporary commissioners from the private sector. There is a Public Enterprise Evaluation Bureau. This bureau functions as a permanent secretariat of the Management Evaluation Council. The director of the bureau is the executive secretary of the council and also the de jure member of board of directors of all GIEs. There is a GIE Management Evaluation Ad Hoc Task Force. This task force is given charge of actually carrying out the performance evaluation. Just in the case of India, there is another similar kind of a task force which is established by South Korean government. The members of this task force are experts in their respective fields such as professors in economics, business administration, experts from research institutions, businessmen, and financial experts. There is a GIE Special Task Force. The purpose of this task force is to balance the skill, knowledge, and expertise between the government and GIE, which is needed for performance evaluation. The task force consists of highly qualified personnel from within the GIE, so essentially creating a unit within the GIEs. There are sectoral technical ministries which also are involved in this process. This interference of the sectoral and technical ministries has been reduced drastically by this act. The ministries are directed to formulate sectoral policies to be carried out in sync with the national development strategy. The ministries are tasked, therefore, to discuss and reach agreement upon management by objectives. In the year 1999, this GIE Act was revised in order to improve the efficiency of enterprises. The law was revised to enhance operational autonomy, accountability, and transparency of public enterprises. The measures introduced by this revision included abolishing of government-appointed board of directors and adopting a system of standing and non-standing directors. Recruitment of CEOs was changed. The recruitment pattern itself was changed, and the recruitment was done by Presidential Nomination Committee, along with the signing of management performance contracts for their respective jobs. A new management disclosure system was also introduced, where it required the enterprises to reveal management information such as financial reports and management reviews over the internet, which was available for the public to view. Citizens' charters were also introduced as a measure to enhance autonomy and accountability of public enterprises. Citizen charters also help to promote consumer consciousness. Regular customer satisfaction surveys were also conducted with a similar objective. Lastly, several measures to improve efficiency and competitiveness of state-owned enterprises in Korea were introduced through performance-based salaries for senior management, external monitoring of management, knowledge-based management systems, and economic value added systems EVA. Some of the highlighting features of performance contracts of GIEs in South Korea are increased managerial autonomy over operational aspects such as budget, procurement, and personnel, incentivizing performance by linking incentives to performance results, comprehensive evaluation of performance through selection of specific and multiple objectives, implementation of performance contract within the organizational arrangements. The performance contracts introduced in South Korean enterprises broadly had qualitative and quantitative indicators, just as the Indian system of performance contracts, which is called the system of MOU, has both financial and non-financial indicators. In the same way, South Korean system also has two categories of indicators: quantitative indicators and qualitative indicators. Under the quantitative indicators are objective indicators of measuring performance through numerical estimates. Quantitative indicators employ objective performance, trend analysis, and beta data distribution methods. In the performance over management method, evaluation scores for SOEs range from 0 to 100 points. There are certain qualitative indicators also which state-owned enterprises have introduced. Korea utilizes a 9-scale grading evaluation method to evaluate the non-quantitative indicators as opposed to quantitative indicators. The overall performance of the public enterprises is determined through an aggregate score which combines both qualitative as well as quantitative indicators, and the respective weighted values are derived. These evaluations are then required to be submitted to the ministries and to the National Assembly. There are some very interesting and important systems and processes that the Korean government has evolved and sustained for enhancing the efficiency of enterprises, and one of the main things is the incentive system. The evaluation system for public enterprises is linked to the incentive system in the form of bonuses. The task force conducts the performance evaluation each year, and the bonus size varies from 0% to 500% of monthly wages depending on the evaluation results. The system also involves non-pecuniary incentives and sanctions. Awards are handed to the highest scoring enterprises, while enterprises that are performing poorly can have sanctions. Even the top management can be dismissed. Finally, an important part of the entire system is the wide publicity of results of the performance evaluation in mass media. The public comes to know about the performance of public enterprises. Public recognition plays an important role in the Korean society and is a powerful motivational tool for performance of top management. Now let us look at the performance contracting system in Ghana. Ghana is also one of the leading countries which has done very well on performance contracting of public enterprises. Ghana in the year 1980 introduced this system. The Ghana Cocoa Board, along with 16 other enterprises, formed the core of public sector enterprises. The Ghana Cocoa Board was a major source of revenue for the state, while the other 16 core public enterprises were in other important sectors such as energy, transportation, and communication sectors. However, by the 70s and early 80s, these core enterprises and their performance started suffering and prompted the public sector reform program, which was introduced in 1987. The performance contracting system for public enterprises was introduced with the start of Public Enterprise Reform Program in Ghana. The The performance contracting system was introduced with the aim of improving the performance of core state-owned enterprises. Performance contracts provided to be an important tool for managing interaction between the government and enterprise, while initially it was seen only as a temporary and contributing tool for improving performance of the core enterprises. Prior to this period, the state-owned enterprise governance, both in terms of legal and institutional mechanism, has been deteriorating, while declining economic development and rising political instability. In the year 1982, first attempts were made to restore the discipline in the public enterprise governance system. A law was enacted in 1982 in order to regulate the public enterprises, which was meant that the law was meant that the existing SOE management system through board of directors was removed. In its place, an interim management committee was put in place. This legislation heralded a period of SOE self-management for nearly 1 decade, in which the state-owned enterprise management was virtually out of the hands of sectoral ministries, and it went into the hands of those committees, which comprised of its own employees. It was in this background that the performance contracts was first signed as a part of the SOE reform program in Ghana. The overall reform program of public enterprises included tools like planning, monitoring and evaluation system, which is a PME system, which adapts the corporate plan to the economic realities, negotiating annual performance objectives and targets, quarterly reporting and annual evaluations. The reform also included an annual cycle of setting performance objectives between the sectoral ministry and enterprise. The State Enterprise Commission and the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning also formed party to this annual cycle, thus linking all the stakeholders. Let us look at some of the elements of the PMA system in Ghana. The PMA system formed an essential feature of the SOE reform program, which was introduced by the government of Ghana in the early 1990s. In fact, one of the main functions was to manage and implement this system. The system incorporates 3 essential elements: updating the corporate plan of the enterprises, negotiating the performance contracts, and quarterly monitoring and annual evaluation reporting of performance. Now let us see how these corporate plans, which are one of the core areas of this reform program, how they are done. The introduction of corporate plan was an important part of the performance contracting system. The performance contracts actually originated from the annual plans, from the annual corporate plans. Prior to the performance contracts, corporate plan was not a standard feature in many of the core enterprises. We can also see the same elements in India. Even in the Indian public enterprise system, all the public enterprises are encouraged to develop their annual corporate plans, and the performance targets are linked to them. In the case of Ghana, introduction of corporate plans was an important part of the performance contracting system. Prior to performance contracts, corporate plan was not a standard feature in many of the core enterprises. Neither the sectoral ministries nor the enterprise management had much experience in preparing such corporate plans, and so external consultants were relied on to prepare the corporate plans. However, using external consultants to prepare the corporate plans did not meet much success, as the sectoral ministries and enterprise managers were confused and unable to adapt these plans because they were not made by themselves. In the early 90s, most of the enterprises had started preparing their own corporate plans without the help of external consultants, but updating their corporate plans annually on a regular basis. Performance contracting system in Ghana worked as an instrument for enhancing performance efficiency, and these contracts were entered into by the state-owned enterprise management and their respective sectoral ministry. In 1991, the contracts had a standardized format which had the following elements. The performance contract had a set of objectives to start with. The performance contracts had performance indicators detailed out, which were to be monitored, and annual targets to be achieved during the contract period. It was a mutual understanding of government and the enterprise. It was a critical arrangement made in the setting targets and reporting requirements. So the performance contracts entered into by the Ghana public enterprises had these features. They started with objectives. They detailed out the indicators which had to be monitored and reviewed during the year, and it was a kind of an agreement between the public enterprises and their respective administrative ministries. The performance indicators identified in the performance contracts were broadly financial or economic indicators, efficiency and productivity indicators, dynamic indicators, management improvement, and projects were also one of the key elements which were part of the performance contracts. However, at the time of evaluation of performance, the targets were in three categories: financial, dynamic, management improvement projects. Now let us look at the performance contracting system in China. Performance contracting system plays a major role in state-owned enterprises in China, with a large number of such contracts being signed between enterprise managers and the government. Starting in the mid-1980s, the Chinese started performance contracting system, and by 1986 it had acquired a significant role. The performance contracting system had become national policy of public enterprise reform between 1987 and 1994. China has one of the largest experiments with performance contracting. One of the World Bank reports says that some more than 10 lakh performance contracts in China in the manufacturing sector, utilities, and other monopolies have been done. In China, during the Cultural Revolution, the remuneration for employees and managers was completely independent of individual or firm performance. In fact, the profits or losses that the firms incurred were absorbed by the state, which left managers and employees having no incentive to improve the performance of the firm. In the 1970s, this system changed. The reform started towards incentivizing individuals and enterprises' performance. And so, China transitioned from a centralized system where uniform wages were set by the central government to a decentralized system where individual performance was given importance. In the year 1978, select firms were chosen on a trial basis to try this new decentralized system where bonuses were linked to the performance of the individual. And in keeping with this policy, the use of performance bonuses and incentive system began. The contract system in China follows the following principles. In order to strengthen the enterprise and help in realizing its potential, performance contracts are used. The performance contract also follows the principle of autonomy of management. The performance contract is based on the principle of responsibility binding by this contract. This contract binds responsibility on the enterprise as well as the ministry for an agreed performance. It also believes in rationalization of internal management by initiating reforms so that the objectives are achieved. The system of contractual management in China has made clear the economic responsibility of the enterprise to the state and has provided enterprises with relatively clearer and stable economic expectations, which has given a strong incentive to the management. The contractual system, motivated by the contract incentives, has promoted the reform of internal administration and thus increased the internal capacity of the enterprise. So here we conclude the part 1 of the session on performance management system of public enterprises, global experiences, we have looked at systems in France, in South Korea, in China, and in Ghana. In the part 2, we will look at the signaling system and how Pakistan, Venezuela, Ghana, Gambia, Senegal have worked on performance contracting. There are a couple of countries which have followed the signaling system of performance contract. Basically, performance contracts have been classified into two categories. First is the performance contracts based on the French model of performance contracting system. The second system is called the signaling system. The signaling system has been adopted by Pakistan, Korea, Venezuela for improving public enterprise performance. Let us look at the Pakistani experience with performance contracting system. Pakistan adopted the signaling system of performance contract essentially to improve the operational efficiency of public enterprises. Unlike other countries, Pakistan adopted a system where the enterprises were characterized by a combination of adverse financial and operational features, and they were going through severe declining profitability leading to weak financial structures. They developed imbalances in debt equity ratios and inefficient asset usage. As a result, in the early 1980s, the government entrusted the task of new investments to the private sector. The public sector was expected to improve its operational efficiency. The government of Pakistan took a decision to adopt the signaling system to improve the efficiency of public enterprises. The components of performance contracting system in Pakistan included a performance information system to measure accuracy, a performance evaluation system to specify socially desirable behavior, a performance incentive system to reward good performance. The development of this system took about 3 years. During this process, major efforts were made to evolve a performance information system. In 1983, the government approved the operation of this system with little modifications. The signaling system originally envisaged social profitability, known as public profitability, as the primary indicator of performance. However, in approving the signaling system, private profitability instead of proposed public profitability at constant prices was kept as the primary criteria of evaluation. Practically in Pakistan, the performance information system and performance incentive system survived, while the third part suffered a major blow. According to Sheikh, in 1980, the real reasons for this conceptual compromise are the government feared situations in which the loss-making firms had to be given bonuses because they performed well on public profitability indicators. It was deemed that the public relations and political costs associated with such cases might be too heavy for the government. Further, the government thought that by opting for financial profits as targets, it would be able to deal more effectively with the constant nuisance of petitions for relief by loss-making enterprises. The institutional mechanism for implementing the performance contracting system in Pakistan is replicated in most of the countries. The Expert Advisory Cell is an independent technical cell which was established by Pakistan. This is a best practice which is talked about in the performance contracting system literature. The Expert Advisory Cell was a unit established to assist the ministry in performing this function. The need of this unit was felt since the ministry run by civil servant was not equipped with the expertise required for this function. One of the main tasks of the cell was to identify the ways and means of improving the performance of public enterprises. It was identified that there was a need for setting up institutional arrangements to guide and evaluate the performance of managers so that they could also be rewarded for good performance. The main principles of this cell was to set efficient targets, to set targets which were clear cut, to set targets which were neither very low or very high, and to assist enterprises to look into their own unique environment and take into their environment into account while deciding the targets. Africa is another country which has done quite well with the performance contracting system of public enterprises. Though quite a few less developed countries may claim to have a contractual relationship between the government of public enterprise, the credit for pioneering this system goes to Senegal. Senegal was the first country which did a lot of work around performance contracting. They were the first countries to adopt the French model of performance contract. The Senegalese contract system turned out to be similar to that of the French contracts. The initiative for adopting this system came from the Prime Minister's office. There was a top support for implementing the performance contracting system in Senegal. The public enterprise managers welcomed this move and they looked at it as an opportunity to get compensated for the non-commercial objectives imposed on them. Through it, they also hoped for increased autonomy and decreased outside interference. The Senegalese contracts, as already mentioned, bear a remarkable similarity to the French contracts. The Prime Minister's office was involved in the design and execution of the contracts. The contracts did not work the way it should have been. It was primarily because preconditions relating to the criteria were not satisfactorily fulfilled. The Senegalese contracts had terminology like accommodate, obligation, which were vague and made the whole exercise very subjective. The heavy emphasis, according to the World Bank report, was on the fact that performance of virtually all enterprises in the sector began to show dramatic deterioration in the contract periods. This result was a direct consequence of the way contracts were structured. The entire exercise had a positive influence too. The public enterprises started strategically planning for the first time. The government started seriously comparing the costs of social objective and investment proposals with their benefits. Ghana is another country in the African region which introduced the performance contracting system and did succeedingly well. The performance contracting system for public enterprises was introduced in Gambia in 1987. As a prelude to identifying those public enterprises to come under the performance contracting system, the public enterprise sector was divided into 3 schedules: enterprises in which the government is a minority shareholder, enterprises in which the government is a majority shareholder, strategic corporations and departments. In 1987, under the first phase of performance contracts introduction, the contracts were developed for 3 enterprises only. Under the second phase in 1990, performance contracts were developed for another 3 enterprises. In 1994, the third phase, another 3 enterprises were included in the performance contracting system. The contracts were executed for a period of 3 years and were signed by His Excellency the President on behalf of the government and by the Managing Director on behalf of the enterprise. The performance contracts usually had the following elements: the definition of the enterprise, identification of the commercial and non-commercial activities of the enterprise, development of the mechanism for reimbursement of non-commercial social services, selection of performance indicators and fixing targets for a particular year, determination of management incentives, sanction scheme. After the introduction of performance contract system, the ultimate control and responsibility was taken over by the Office of the President. The President executed the contracts on behalf of the government. The steering committees had representatives from the line ministries, the Office of the President, National Investment Board, and the enterprises themselves. These committees were given the responsibility of approving the budgets, deciding upon the performance indicators, targets, performance evaluation, and management incentive, bonus, and sanctions. The line ministries were expected to concentrate their efforts on the development of sectoral policies, objectives, and the framework within which public enterprises were expected to operate. The infrastructure arrangements for implementing the contracts in Gambia included: for each enterprise, a steering committee was set up comprising of the chief executive of the enterprise, secretary general of the Office of the President, permanent secretaries of the ministries, economic affairs, trade, industry, and the line ministry, and the solicitor general. The National Investment Board reviews the corporate plan, annual budget, performance indicators, targets, weights, and cost of non-commercial activities. Members of the steering committee also review the corporate plan, annual budget, performance indicators, targets, weights. Contracts are signed by the president on behalf of the government and the managing director on behalf of the enterprise. The enterprise submits quarterly and annual performance reports. The NIB receives the annual audited accounts, and Office of the President reviews and approves the evaluation and award of bonus. Bangladesh is also a very important experiment that was done in Bangladesh. Bangladesh initiated the process of contracting in the year 1985. Only those enterprises which generated exceptionally good revenues, 89% of the total revenues, were included in the category of contract signing enterprises. A typical performance contract in Bangladesh included indicators like production, profitability, internal management systems, etc. The process of performance contracting in Bangladesh began with preparing the performance improvement plan, analyzing the objectives of the enterprise as well as the past performance of the enterprise in order to formulate a true picture. This is followed by identification of critical success factors and classifying the factors of accountability. This leads to a discussion of strategic issues of the enterprise, which culminates in the formulation of a performance improvement plan. The next step of the process involves defining the performance criteria and assigning weightage to them. A process of negotiating the targets with the concerned ministries and committees and finalizing the draft follows this. The next steps is monitoring the contracts both quarterly and bi-monthly through a monitoring system and takes necessary corrective action if necessary. In the year 2007, Bhutan also introduced the system of performance contracting in public enterprises. The Bhutanese royal government, through a royal charter, established Druk Holdings and Investments DHI to hold and manage the existing and future investments of the royal government for the long-term benefits of citizens of Bhutan. The company holds 18 different companies with varying control interests. The Ministry of Finance is the sole stakeholder with regards to Druk Holdings and Investment. The company has in place a very robust performance management system or the performance contracting system in the form of annual performance plans and compacts. They're also called annual performance compacts. The compacts permeate various levels from the Ministry of Finance and DHI and all the other employees of the companies, such as a compact between the Ministry of Finance and DHI, DHI Board and DHI Compact, DHI and Companies Compact, Companies and Department, Division Compacts, Departments and Employees Compacts. So multi-stakeholder agreements are done here. The annual compact cycle starts with the planning and setting of targets. The first step in this is to identify the various activities linked to the outcome and outputs, followed by the setting of annual targets and finalizing the draft compact. The next stage of the compact cycle includes the monitoring and coaching, where the midterm impacts and the midterm review is done. This midterm review looks at the deliverables to be submitted and midterm corrections are also done. The third stage is the evaluation of performance, where the annual compact deliverables are submitted and an annual compact evaluation is conducted. And finally, the last step of the annual cycle ends with the recognition and awarding of performance incentives to good performing enterprises. The compact document is structured into two parts. The first section elaborates the performance indicators, which are of two kinds: financial indicators and non-financial indicators. The second section of the compact details out each of the financial and non-financial indicators. The document has 4 columns, where the second column lists out the performance indicators which make up the other 50% of the weightage. The third column assigns target outputs for the performance indicators listed out in the second column, and fourth column sets deadlines for achievements of these targets. The last column of the document allots the weightages of each of the target and indicators for the performance evaluation. There is a robust institutional mechanism which has been put in place by the Royal Bhutanese government to review the performance of these compacts. The institutional mechanism for performance in evaluation includes the DHI, which is responsible for planning, monitoring and evaluation of the performance compacts, while the Board Committee for Performance Management is responsible for recognition and performance incentives, which are given at the end of the annual cycle of compacts. The performance incentives for the company are based on compact achievement points. Finally, we sum up this module. We have till now looked at some of the performance contracting systems being implemented by countries like France, South Korea, China, African countries like Ghana, Gambia, Senegal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bhutan. The performance contracting for public enterprises has been a process initiated by all these countries, beginning with France, which took the first initiative. This system was primarily meant to enhance the efficiency and productivity of public enterprises, which were declining their performance at the point when these countries introduced the performance contracting system, and this performance contracting system helped the enterprises to streamline their functioning and also gave them mechanism to review their performance and their outputs at the end of the year. The performance contracting system has been adopted in many countries, while a few countries have modified according to their own required conditions. So we end the module with this. There are a number of references, there are a number of publications by respective governments, especially the United Nations reports, the World Bank reports on performance contracting system is very widely read and available on the website of the World Bank. You may kindly access these reports for more information.